Hey, this is Josh Rubin from East West Healing and Performance. I've gotten a couple of requests from some subscribers, and what I want to do is a four-part series on stress and adrenal fatigue. I want to talk about what stress is, where it comes from, and keep in mind these are just small clips. We only have, basically 10 minutes times 4, so it's 40 minutes. We could talk about this for about, 4 days. But what I want to talk about is stress, where our stresses might be coming from, what is adrenal fatigue, some of the signs and symptoms, how to test for it, whether subjective or objective, certain herbs and bioidenticals to help treat it and prevent it from coming back. So the bottom line is, what is stress? There's many types of stressors. Well, if we look at stress, stress is basically reactions of the body to forces of deleterious nature, infections, and various abnormal states that tend to disturb our body's normal physiologic equilibrium, or what is called homeostasis. And from my perspective, all dis-ease can be tracked back to stress, okay? And all dis-ease is basically an accumulation of a stress response, okay? It's like people say salt isn't bad for you. The grains are so small. What if I took a grain of salt and put it on the table, right, and never threw it away, and we did that for a year? You'd have a pile of salt. So stress is an accumulation. We're brought into this world with ease, okay? We're supposed to be brought into this world with balance. We're supposed to come from healthy individuals, which nowadays we're not, but it's external programming, external, stressors like food and chemicals and in the environment and blah, 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 and on and on and on that accumulate and cause dis-ease, okay? So that's my perspective on stress. It's people say, well, this is genetic, I was born with it, and blah, 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 blah. Well, I might get a lot of slack for this, but I don't really follow that principle. I believe we create everything that happens to us, okay? You might have been born with it, and you might get cancer or get something as you get older, right? But you might be born with that specific gene, okay? But it's whether or not you control the stresses or adapt to the stresses in your life and eat the right foods, okay, and live in the right place, and think the right thoughts, and do all the necessary things to create homeostasis and fluidity in your life so that gene doesn't wake up, in a sense. But when you start eating, refined processed foods, boxed foods, canned foods, aspartame, a lot of alcohol and pasteurized milk and plastics, and, you're drinking all the time, and you're doing drugs, and you're staying out late, and, you're thinking like crap, and blah, 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 on and on, all these different stresses. Well, it's those things that accumulate and wake up the gene. So I'm not a big on, well, I got this, I was born with it, or it's genetic. Well, do the research, go back, to your grandmother or great-grandmother and their great-grandmother. Well, it wasn't there, and it started at some point, because most of those generations lived off the land, and that part of your family tree didn't have fibromyalgia. It was brought into your part of your family tree at some point. So it's something someone did or you did or didn't do that created it, okay? So everyone reacts differently to stressors, so we got to keep that in mind. A stress to someone might be standing up and giving a talk in front of people, but for someone like myself, it's not. So keep in mind, stresses are all individualized. But when stress or stressors affect the body, they're basically biochemical, meaning you stub your toe, you get in a fight, you get anxious, you eat sugar. Your body reacts to it a lot, very similarly. So it's a biochemical experience internally that happens, and over time, once we bounce out of homeostasis and we have this physiological change, then you basically perpetuate that cycle of disease. So you have homeostasis, physiological changes, pathomorphological changes, which are physical changes, then you have symptoms, and you have death. So usually we focus when we have the symptoms, but there's things that happen prior, like physiological changes and pathomorphological changes that happen, and we need to be able to adapt to those so we can bounce back to homeostasis. But we usually don't focus on any of those things, and typically when we have a symptom, that's when we see the doctor, okay? But usually then sometimes it's too late, or you might have to live with the disease. So if you look at stress, things like that, where does it come from? Well, we have these little glands that are this big on top of the kidneys. They're called the adrenal glands. They produce a lot of hormones, testosterone and estrogen. They also produce basically 50 different types of hormones in 3 different classes. They're called glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, and androgens, okay? These glucocorticoids are what I'm basically talking about. They actually help you fight and adapt to stress. You know, when you get all wound up, fight or flight, the sympathetic part, you know, they help you adapt to stress and fight inflammation, regulate blood sugar, and regulate blood pressure. And then at the same time, they help under, you know, not times of stress. And basically, if you didn't have your adrenal glands or they weren't working properly, you get closer and closer to disease and death and symptoms and wasting and fatigue and things like that. So these are important glands. Typically, if you're not adapting to your stresses, there's a lot of stresses in our life. We have chemical stresses, environmental, physical, nutritional, mental, emotional, spiritual, on and on and on. You know, depending on the person, we might have different levels in each one. But it's you know, knowing your stresses and where they're coming from and learning to adapt to them, right? I'm working out, but I might be working out too much. That's a physical stress. I might have a great job and I love it, but I might be sitting on my butt all day in front of a computer, which we have the electromagnetic stress, and then we have the postural stress of sitting here all day on our spine. So there's many types of stressors. So how do you know if you're, you know, stressed? Well, here are some simple signs that your adrenal glands might be being overworked, or that your body might be under some sort of stress. Typically, we see anxiety and fears. We see increased mental activity like ADHD. We see altered breathing, typically hyperventilation. We see gastric issues, typically constipation, because when your body's in a sympathetic stress state, blood goes from the GI system, right, and the reproductive system to the muscles and brain so you can do what you want to do. So the question is, if men are having libido issues and women having libido issues and someone's constipated, is it the food or is it lack of blood flow, or are they in a sympathetic state? Tremors, increased muscle tension is gigantic. That's a big one. Agitation, elevated heart rate, elevated blood pressure sometimes. And in the last stage of adrenal fatigue, you typically see low blood pressure. Blood sugar fluctuations, increased sweating under just, you know, a low activity, a constant, just, you know, constantly sweating. That's a sympathetic state. You know, those are just some that we can cover on. Typically, you see fatigue, hormone balances, muscle wasting, and weight gain. Okay, so it's important that you know what these are, and where they're coming from, so you can actually adapt to them. Our bodies are always talking to us. Each of you has a specific radio station that your body tunes into. It's whether or not you want to tune into it or not, and actually figure out, okay, well, I'm anxious all the time and I'm sweating. Where's it coming from? It's not just happening. There's something you're doing or not doing that's creating it. Okay. So I kind of went through the different stages of bouncing out of homeostasis. We have homeostasis, then physiological change, pathomorphological, symptom, and then death. You got to figure out, well, am I going to pay attention to my body when I have a symptom? Or am I going to focus on things when I have a physiological change and try to track to homeostasis? The problem with these hormones is that, you know, cortisol, anytime cortisol goes up, you typically see blood sugar fluctuations, and you typically see weight gain, you typically see fatigue. You know, when people are in stage 1, 2, 3 adrenal fatigue, I'll give you some signs and symptoms. You typically see neurotissue health go down, meaning memory and learning go down. You typically see altered bone turnover, because typically from a process called pregnenolone steal, they end up being estrogen dominant. Estrogen stimulates osteoclasts. Progesterone stimulates osteoblasts. When you're estrogen dominant, you don't have enough progesterone to make new bone, and estrogen just keeps breaking it down. You typically see altered carbohydrate metabolism. Okay, you typically see autoimmune issues, and you typically see pro-inflammatory stress because of not enough or too much cortisol. You typically see altered detoxification pathways, skin issues, constipation. And the biggest thing is you see endocrine gland dysfunction in the thyroid, the gut, the hormonal endocrine glands, as well as increased fat deposits on the front of the body and the side of the body. You have receptor sites for cortisol in the belly and receptor sites for insulin on the side. So like I said, our body's always talking to us, okay? So if you look at, you know, the adrenal glands and the stressors, our body's always talking to us. The main thing here is listen to your body, figure out where it's coming from. And in these next couple YouTube clips on adrenal fatigue, we'll go over lab testing and herbs to help prevent it or fight it from coming back. Thank you.